The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Gracious God of love, gracious God of witness, gracious God of hope and togetherness, especially in this time where we are so separated and asked to be either quarantined or apart in one form or the other, with self-distancing and social distancing, physical distancing, and so much more distancing. We come to hear and learn of how we can hold each other, how we can support each other, how we can use the language in communication to love each other and respect each other. Bless us with your wisdom. Bless us with your peace and patience at this time as we dialogue and learn, all for your kingdom's glory. This we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. And to you, Pastor Lindsay.
Thanks so much. Today I'll share my screen. I have a presentation for you. If during that presentation you have a question, please note it in the chat. If you can take a look at the chat as we're going through and uplift those questions for me, that would be great. If not, please do hold your questions for the end. I plan for some time for us to be able to engage in conversation then. But just to allow all the information to come through, I am going to share a presentation with you today, hopefully to help with that. So just get this set up here. Great. So as Prima said, my name is Pastor Lindsay. I use they, them, their pronouns, and I serve at Holy Spirit Lutheran Church. And as a start off, I'd just like to acknowledge and respect the land on which I'm presenting from, which is Treaty 6 territory. And I'd invite you to remember the land that you're on, a land of many stories and many peoples, especially Indigenous peoples who have worked these lands long before us and lived on these lands. And you'll get to hear part of the presentation today are two-spirited, are members of this community that we're speaking of as we learn how to be better allies today. So I invite you into a time of learning with me, and again, feel free to ask some questions as we go. So an important part of learning is what I find to be online searches. So in our life and our world today, we know that the internet is a great place to start for resources. Maybe it won't be the final place, but it's a great starting point. If you hear someone in your community of faith share a term you haven't heard before, Google it. If you're looking for some good information from a source that's maybe a little bit better, Pride centers across Canada and the US, around the world, are a great source of information, usually on their sites, as well as more recognizable sites such as GLAAD or the Human Rights Organization would be great places to start off. There's lots of great resources and books and podcasts that can be an entry point for any learning that you may wish to take part in. But it's just important to note that anytime you're asking someone from a particular community to teach you something, define something for you, there's emotional energy being expended there. There's also some trust that needs to be there because it's a vulnerable position that person's in to try to account for their whole community. So today I'm largely speaking for myself as someone who's rather privileged within the queer community, but I am happy to do that for you today, and I'm glad to be in a relationship with you and able to do that. But that's not to say every person of the LGBTQ2SIA+ community is able to do that or would want to engage in that way. So I ask that, if you do have questions, you can certainly reach out to me at any time. I'm happy to respond when I'm able. So starting off with something I just mentioned, we'll go with privilege. If you're finding that the comment box or the faces you see in a small box on your screen are in the way of the diagram, you can move it on your own screen to a better place. So what is privilege? Privilege is one way we come to know ourselves within community. And it's one way we come to be adopted within community. When we look and act in a similar way to those around us, we are often able to fully participate and fit in without any issues from the very start. In fact, our privilege may even give us a head start in many of these relationships, opportunities, and roles, which may come to play out throughout our lives. We can define privilege as a set of unearned benefits to people who fit into specific social groups. Society grants privilege to people because of certain aspects of their identity. Aspects of a person's identity can include things like race, class, gender expression, sexual orientation, language, geographical location, ability, education, and religion, to name a few. And while this diagram you'll see on the screen is one example of this, it's not perfect, but it helps us kind of see on a sliding scale where we may find ourselves within this wheel of power and privilege. Of course, none of us are fully privileged in every category, but we experience privilege in different ways. And so it's one way we can begin to think about how we involve others, how we see others, and how we see ourselves, and how others may need more aid to reach a state of equality within, let's say, our church community, or to be seen more fully as children of God. There are certain different diagrams you can see, largely probably ones with a fence with a bunch of people standing who can see and can't see a baseball game. That's another way to think about privilege. But I find this one to be more helpful because it names a lot of the different privileges and oppressions that we come to face in our world. So moving on from there, as I shared, pronouns are important, and my pronouns are they, them, and theirs. I'm guessing many of us within this room have never given much thought to the pronouns we come to use or the pronouns others use for us. This is because for many people, the pronouns that they come to be associated with tend to fit within their construct of their gender and personhood as they're growing up. For many people, this means their pronouns and their use come to affirm their personhood to the very core of their being in everyday situations. When you go out to a restaurant, when we could go out to a restaurant, you would likely not to have to worry about the pronouns the server would use for you. Perhaps the only time this isn't true in Alberta or other places is when the colloquial term, "hey guys," is used if that's something that doesn't feel good to you. Or you're sirred or you're ma'amed in a way that doesn't feel right. This is largely because for a long time we've lived in a binary society and world where we only thought there was two options, masculine, feminine, male, or female, ways to name ourselves within our pronouns. So she, her, and hers, or he, him, and his. However, these are not the only pronouns that we've come to use within our world. In fact, in 2015, the singular form of they was named Word of the Year, and a whole new conversation around personal pronouns was catapulted into the mainstream world for us to consider. But this was always a conversation that had been taking place within the queer community. As many spaces, people fought and sought to find ways to feel recognized as they truly were. This is because we've often named ourselves in safer places in ways that affirmed our identities in maybe ways that we wouldn't in the outside world. So respecting chosen names and pronouns and nicknames becomes a very important part of allyship within the queer community. And it's an easy step that we can all take. So why is respecting someone's chosen pronouns so important? It's because pronouns are like peanut butter. So who here, give me a little wave, likes peanut butter? Okay, we have some peanut butter likers. I do not like peanut butter as much. My wife loves it. And there's some people we know who are allergic to peanut butter. It's actually kind of a deadly thing to them. But one thing we know about peanut butter is that it actually is really good at sticking to toast. If you make a piece of toast and you assume someone wants peanut butter on it and they like that, and you slather peanut butter all over that toast, they are going to be so happy because that peanut butter is never coming off. However, if you've ever had a 3-year-old in your life who decides they want peanut butter at one point and then minutes later decides they don't want peanut butter, you know how difficult it can be to scrape peanut butter off toast. it's not coming off. You have to throw that toast away and start again. For many of us, our pronouns are the same way. If we have a certain set of pronouns we use each day, if suddenly someone uses a different set that doesn't feel right, that can sit with us in a way that's not maybe seemingly deeply harmful at the start. But if throughout the day, people continue to use a name that's not your own, refer to you in ways that don't feel helpful, and don't recognize the full identity of who you are, it can become taxing. So very much like peanut butter toast, our pronouns are one way that we can respect and learn to respect others and help them throughout their day. For many people like myself who are more comfortable with more gender neutral pronouns such as they, them, and theirs, when my pronouns are respected, I see seen and heard. And if people mess up, that's okay. It's okay to say sorry and simply move on and say they or Lindsay. It may be something that you're on a learning curve for, and that's okay. But what's important is trying to make right or trying to just continue on with conversation. It's one small way that you can show your allyship. And if you're not sure what someone's pronouns are, it's okay to ask. And the easiest way to do that is to say, hi, my name's Lindsay. I use they, them, their pronouns. What's your name? Do you have pronouns you prefer? And if they say, what are pronouns? Then you can say, oh, that's something I just learned about. What pronouns do you use? She, her, hers, he, him, his, they, them, theirs. If they know about pronouns, they're probably going to say, thank you for asking, or simply tell you what their pronouns are. For some people, they use different pronouns depending on the day or how they're feeling. If someone is kind of more fluid in their, they may tell you, I use they, them, and she, her. I use he, him, and she, her. Or use any pronoun. And so it's really just learning about these individuals in your life and how to respect and come alongside them as they express who they are in the world. So I do have a table for you of a couple different pronouns you'll see in one. It kind of says the pronouns, and then it kind of walks them through their progression. So he, him, his, pretty normal for us all to learn how these things work. I know some of us grammar can be a difficult thing to get over in using the singular they, but you can see it here for that purpose, as well as the other pronouns people may come to use. And so it's really just important that when someone says, this is the pronoun I'd like to use, it's very much like someone telling you, this is the name I'd like you to call me. You probably wouldn't continue calling them by a name they didn't wish to use. So try to use the pronouns that they're asking you to use as a way to honor them and to see them. And again, knowing that it's okay if you make a mistake and you can continue on in that relationship. So there's a bunch of definitions that we can walk through today. I've already used one term quite a few times, which is LGBTQ2SIA+, which is an abbreviation or umbrella term for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer and or questioning, two-spirit, intersex, and asexual peoples. And what you can see from that list is there's a plus on the end, and it incorporates as many of the names you see on the screen as is possible. And why is it important to say that whole alphabet of letters instead of just LG or LGBT or queer or Q? It's because a lot of these identities still are not being recognized or respected within our lives and world, and especially I'd say within the church. The church hasn't done the work. So it's important for us to continue to use the names and the abbreviations that the community has said. This feels affirming to us. So please don't shorten this. It takes some time to say, but it's important. And even you can practice it a few times. LGBTQ2SIA+. One small way we can show that we are learning and we're trying to be expansive in our welcome. So I'll first walk through sexual orientation and the definitions associated there. So we see on the screen, the first one is lesbian, which is a term that describes a woman who is attracted to women. Gay, a term that describes a man who is attracted to men. However, we know this term is also used by other people within the queer community. Bisexual, a term that describes someone attracted to their same gender and to another gender or another gender expression. Queer, For some, this is a reclaimed term used by members of the LGBTQ2SIA+ community to describe people who identify as non-heterosexual, transgender, or who exist outside the gender binary. Due to its historical use as a derogatory term, it's not embraced by all community members. So this is not a word an outsider would necessarily use for our community, but an insider could say, I am queer, I identify as queer, or we are queer people. In that case, you can then describe someone as, hey, Lindsay told me they are queer. That would be appropriate, but calling Lindsay queer without knowing that would not. I know it seems like something that's maybe not quite as easy to remember, but it's certainly an important part of our walk as people of faith. Another thing that's important to note is that as we think back to that wheel of power, there's certain identities within all these identities that we know exist in probably a place of privilege. So there is racism within the queer community. And so sometimes you'll see people add beside queer, person of color, or POC, or Black queer. And these are just ways for people to name within this community that there's other identities they're lifting up because they felt oppression. So it can be important to acknowledge these other identities too, if that person feels that that feels right for them. Asexual, a term that describes a spectrum of people who feel no sexual attraction towards people of any gender identity or sexual orientation, and or people who may desire some level of personal relationship with people, but for whom that relationship does not involve sexual intimacy. And then we have polyamorous, or poly-A, which is a term that describes a spectrum of people who have an orientation towards consensual, non-monogamous relationships. These relationships often involve contracts or verbal contracts and agreements between multiple people. Heterosexual, so a term that describes someone who is attracted to people of a different gender. And the plus, many more. There's probably other terms you've heard, and if there are, we can discuss those today. So those are all under the umbrella of sexual orientation. Next, moving on to gender identities. So cisgender is an umbrella term used to describe a person whose gender identity is congruent with the sex they were assigned at birth. So cisgender. Transgender, or trans, is an umbrella term used to describe a spectrum of people whose experience a disconnect between their sex and their gender identity, or whose sex and gender identity are incongruent with the sex they were assigned at birth. Trans. So we say in terms of the community that if someone is trans and they are male, they are simply a man. If they are trans and they are a woman, they are simply a woman. You don't have to say trans woman, trans man, unless that's an identity someone has told you is important to them. They're simply men, they're simply women who happen to be trans. Similar to all of us gathered here, there's certain terms that feel good for us and we use those in ways to identify ourselves. And so just respecting where that person's at is important. Two-spirit. An umbrella term traditionally used by some Indigenous peoples to recognize individuals who possess qualities or fulfill roles of multiple gender identities. Now, this is one term that really should only be and can only be used by Indigenous peoples and communities. This is not for settlers to use, and it's really something that we're learning more about and is being reclaimed by many Indigenous communities and queer people in Indigenous communities. Intersex, an umbrella term used to describe a spectrum of people who have a combination of chromosomes, gonads, hormones, internal sex organs, and genitalia that differ from the assumed gender binary. Non-binary, a gender identity that indicates a person whose identity lands outside the gender binary for any number of reasons. Common identity labels include gender fluid, gender queer, gender variant, agender, gender neutral, NB, and androgynous. And last, bigender is an umbrella term used by some to recognize individuals who feel they express qualities or fulfill roles of two gender identities. And so this can include one day presenting more masculine and one day presenting more feminine. As with many of these titles for gender identities, again, these are on a spectrum. So it's not necessarily that things would have to be one way one day and one way another day, but really it's quite a fluid thing for many people within this spectrum. And so not to comment on someone's particular, oh, but yesterday you were wearing pants, why are you wearing a dress today? That wouldn't necessarily be appropriate, but to acknowledge, let's say, wow, you're looking really great today. I like your choice of whatever clothing item it is more affirming. So looking for those ways we can affirm people in their expression of these gender identities is one way to be an ally, as well as to say what terminology fits best for you. How do you identify? Not that we need to know this, but it's one way that might help them better explain to you as their pastor or someone involved in their life how they're feeling about their gender or their sexual orientation.
Pastor Lindsay, before we move further,
Sure.
There was just a question and a comment that pansexual and sexual orientation was not touched on. If you can talk about that a little bit.
For sure. So pansexual is a sexual, romantic, or emotional attraction towards people regardless of their sex or gender identity. So pansexual kind of says, I love people. I don't necessarily love identities. And so that's one way people have come to identify. Another thing I'll name is just that a lot of younger people in my community don't identify with any label at all. They don't want a label put upon them. They just want to be part of the community. And so if someone says they don't have a label, they don't have a term that represents them, that's also okay. They're part of the community too. Thanks for that question. Okay, so just wanting to give you some important dates to know as allies of the community, and then we'll be coming to kind of towards the end of the presentation, we can engage in some more conversation. So October 11th has come and gone, but it's National Coming Out Day, or NCOD. Every year on the 11th of October, since the late 80s, National Coming Out Day has been a feature of our community. First celebrated under the idea of kind of feminist and gay liberation thought that the personal is political, that by coming out, you're creating visibility for others if you're able to do that, and that it's a sign of hope for many who are in the closet. Today, there's a lot of parameters placed around this. It was really seen as an act of protest in the 80s when it wasn't so safe to come out, especially if you're thinking of the AIDS crisis and a lot of those times that people became quite stigmatized. So today, what we often say about National Coming Out Day is we empower people to come out and support them in coming out, but it's never necessary to come out. Coming out is something that is a person's own decision, that they do so when they feel like it, when they feel safe, when they feel supported. And for some people, they choose never to come out. So it's important to support our people where they're at, but just acknowledging that this could be a day that would be important to some people in your community of faith who are part of the queer community, or who want to come out on a specific day with many other people. The second date, which is just coming up shortly, is Trans Day of Remembrance, or TDOR. It happens each year on the 20th. And for those who haven't come, it's quite a solemn experience. Many cities in COVID times would host their own Trans Day of Remembrance ceremony, often put on by a pride center or a group of local activists who come together to honor those who have lost their lives in acts of anti-transgender violence that year. And it is celebrated for each, or commemorated for each calendar year. So from November 20th till November 20th often. The names for this year have not been released, but each year what happens at the ceremony, similar to what we might think of All Saints or Remembrance Day, is the names of all those who have died are read aloud, along with their country, their name, their age, if we know it, and also how they were killed. And so last year there was 331 names that were read aloud. And we know that many of these names often come from Brazil and Mexico. Unfortunately, it's a large place of violence for trans bodies and trans people, and it's a very solemn experience. And if you know someone in your community who's going to one of these, it would be good to ask if they'd like accompaniment. It can be hard to sit through 331 names, and some of their deaths are quite graphic and violent. And so hearing and holding space for those, often candles are lit. And since this began in January of 2008, a total of 3,314 names have been read. And what we know about statistics is often the names we know are representatives of so many more. So that's why it's important that each name is read. And for those people we don't know the names of, the information is stated simply as unknown. So there's often quite a list of unknowns included in there. International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia is termed IDAHOT. It doesn't include all the letters, but that's what they've come up with. And so if you hear about IDAHOT, that's what it's talking about. May 17th each year. And it started off as the International Day Against Homophobia. And since 2005, it's become IDAHOT. It's a day to uplift breaking silence around these ways that the community is oppressed, and is one way for allies to come alongside and say, you know, I'm here and I'm with you, and this isn't okay. Historically, the reason it began was, again, being removed from the World Health Organization's removal of homosexuality from a list of mental disorders. As we know, it used to be in the DSM that homosexuality was a mental disorder. We now know that's not true. So this is a day to kind of celebrate that and fight against that. And lastly, Pride Month, or Pride, which happens in June. And this actually began because of the Stonewall riots, which were a series of spontaneous demonstrations by members of the LGBTQ2SI+ community in response to police raids and brutality and violence. And this started in New York in June 28th, 1969 at the Stonewall Inn. And so the patrons of the inn at that point on that date stated that they no longer wanted to put up with this violence. And those people who began the riot were largely transgender, people of color, Black individuals who were the most oppressed. And so now our community celebrates Pride often in June to remember this, that Pride is not just a party, but is also a protest and a fight for rights and against the oppressions of our people. It started as the gay liberation movement, and the Pride flag originally had more than the colors that you see on the screen, and they each have a meaning behind them, so you can look further into that. It's become the symbol of the movement and of a people united even across differences. So lastly, just to say that coming out is something that doesn't just happen once, but happens again and again and again and again. Anytime anyone from the community meets someone new, they need to come out. Anytime they meet a new doctor, they often need to come out. If they're coming to a church, they wonder if they'll be safe, and they'll probably have to come out. So acknowledging that if someone is expending this emotional energy with you to tell you about themselves, it's because they care about you, they want to be in relationship with you, and they really want to be a part of your community. So to honor that, respect that, and say, thank you for telling me, it's really important. I'll do my best to honor you, but let me know how I can do that also. A simple way to say is on your Facebook, or in a sermon, or via other social media. I'm a pastor who would support people as they're coming out on days like IDAHOT or Trans Day of Remembrance. I support trans people. These are statements that seem easy, and they can be easily said, but also take some work if there's some pushback against those statements, some education to do, and stating why as a pastor you think it would be important to say, I'm a safe person to come out to, or we're a community of faith who honors those who wish to come out and share their identity with us. So just a cartoon I love from Naked Pastor, some heroes of the faith. Many of them are known to us, and then Pat came out of the closet. I appreciate that. So I did say I wanted to leave a lot of time for questions and answers. I will just share briefly some resources I think you may appreciate. So there's 3 on the screen, as well as a few others that I actually just got in the mail that I thought were quite good. So Ministry Among God's Queer Folk, and this is by Bernard Schicksler and David Connec. So that's a pretty great book of pastoral care for the LGBTQ 2SIA plus community or queer folk, talking about privilege and our place of how we read different narratives. Rescuing Jesus, How People of Color, Women, and Queer Christians Are Reclaiming Evangelism by Deborah Jian Lee. And one from our ELCA siblings, Our Lives Matter, A Womanist Queer Theology by Pamela R. Lightsley. So ELCA. Connection from the States. So I will stop sharing my screen at this point just so we can see one another. But happy to entertain questions, any comments, things that would be helpful for you today. It's a lot of information to download in this short span of time, so thank you for coming along the journey.
Richard here. Thanks, by the way, for your presentation. Every time you do this, I think, you make yourself vulnerable, and that takes courage, and I respect that in you.
Thanks, Richard.
One thing I thought about in terms of coming out is also, but from a different direction, is people coming out as allies. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, for sure. So in some ways, it's one small way to experience what the community may feel in coming out. Again, it's not saying that I am gay, but that I support LGBTQ 2SIA plus peoples in my life and world. And I think we've all experienced probably a time in our lives, even if we may have felt this way, that saying that, let's say in the midst of a church, didn't feel safe, or in the midst of our workspace didn't feel safe, or we wondered if others would feel safe. And so talking about that wheel of privilege, one way you can make a space safer is to do that within your privilege of, let's say, being straight, heterosexual, cisgendered, to use some of the definitions that we talked about today and say, I may not be from this community, but I feel the need to say that they're loved by God, that they should be welcomed here. There's nothing the matter with identifying in these ways. And I'm working to be an ally of the community, or I am an ally of the community. And I would welcome them within our space, our community. I think that's one small experience of what it's like to have to kind of come out again and again. And it actually makes the space a little bit safer, because oftentimes if nothing is said, people from the community assume that many people take the side of the oppressor when nothing is said. So many people within the queer community would feel church or Christianity in general as more of an oppressive space, unless it is named as an inclusive, allied space, if that makes sense. Thanks, Richard. Go ahead, Olav.
I want to thank you so much, Lindsay. This is my second time hearing your presentation, and I'm just so grateful for the opportunity to hear it again, and I'd love to hear it even more in the future. When you introduced this the first time, it was learning a new kind of a language, and gosh, I felt awkward because I didn't know how to use these terms, right? And but it's good to feel awkward and get through it. And I think what I appreciate is really getting these terms kind of into my natural vocabulary, so that when I'm in a situation where I don't know, you know, how people are and what they're feeling and who they are, that I want to express a more inclusive presence and not feel so tongue-tied. So I appreciate these sessions, and I look forward to listening to your presentation again and again.
Thanks, Olav. Appreciate that. It's definitely a lot to learn and take in. Yeah. And thanks for your emotional energy in doing that today. I will mention one opportunity if you want to do more education. Reconciling Works, which is out of the ELCA in the States, has several different learning online opportunities over the coming months, whether that's on inclusion, whether that's on anti-racism or anti-oppression work. And so that would be a great way to be involved in some sessions surrounding this further that you could use continuing ed money for, let's say, and dig a little bit deeper with a different group that's kind of their sole work within the ELCA. So Reconciling Works, and you can find those workshops. There's a few upcoming.
Lindsay, I'm wondering, Heidi had asked this question earlier in the chat, and it's a question that I also am unclear on. Could you explain the difference between bisexual and pansexual? Because I am still trying to figure that out.
Yeah, for sure. So pansexual is outside of, I would say, the binary thought of our world. So binary says male, female, masculine, feminine, and pansexual says I exist outside of the binary. I exist outside of kind of what the world would say, choose one or the other, knowing that there's a whole spectrum of identities that they say, I am just attracted to people, to persons. It's kind of the opposite of asexual. Asexual says, I have no attraction to anyone. Sexually, I'm not interested. Pansexual says, I can be attracted to many different people. It's not prescriptive of what they look like, what gender they express, how they themselves see themselves within the world as far as sexual orientation. I'm just attracted to people, romantically interested in people. So that's one thing. And bisexual is kind of a way to name that before that term came to be. So I'm attracted within the gender binary to women and men, people who are masculine and feminine. So kind of two different ways to come at something in a similar fashion. So understand that for sure. Is that helpful? Okay, great.
Lindsay, I too wanted to thank you for this time and other times when you've shared with our Synod, with Synod Council, with candidates for ministry, and appreciate, as others have said, your commitment, your voice, your willingness to share with us all. It's continued learning for me, and I continue to appreciate your willingness to walk with us in this journey. I wanted to take an opportunity just to share with everyone here that we are beginning what we're calling now, the title may change, Welcoming Diversity Ministry Team. So as you know, the Synod has several ministry teams. We've had our first meeting. We're just in the process of developing terms of reference. One of the things that is on the agenda for the team is some kind of recognition within the Synod next year of 10 years since 2011 of the ELCIC's decisions at National Convention. So we want to mark this in some way, and there'll certainly be other pieces that will be the work of this ministry area, this ministry team. Pastor Lindsay is part of that team and others as well across the Synod. And so look forward to that work of that ministry team. And and the work we do together as a synod. So again, Lindsay, thank you for your participation in the ministry team. And as we continue to work together and develop terms of reference, particularly at this point.
Thanks so much. One small Zoom hint I can give you as far as allyship, if you take a look at your nameplate right now, mine actually has my pronouns in it. So I include that in every meeting I'm in. It's one small way, even if people assume, if they know your pronouns, to say pastor whoever, she, her, they, them, he, him. Just to note for other people that it would be safe for them to do the same. Again, using privilege in a way that allows others to open up conversation, or just to know more fully how people can best represent themselves online in community with one another. Richard.
Yeah, thanks. Recently, of course, you visited the Lutheran student movement. They're exploring the theme called to community in Edmonton, and I might be helpful, or maybe just affirming of what you've already said, that the students involved really really engaged with this topic, and a couple of things that what the reason for this partly is that we're updating our welcome statement, the statement that by which we became a Reconciling in Christ community. It's out of date because of, well, because of what you presented in your PowerPoint. But I mean, the language has changed and so on. So we need to acknowledge a wider spectrum. So anyway, the students though, and this is what kind of struck me. First of all, I was struck by the tone of the discussion. Sorry, I'm gonna have to interrupt myself just for a second. I'll come right back.
Sounds good, Richard. And maybe it's a good point to also add, I'm happy to Zoom in. I can't come in person anymore, but to meetings with you or with your people, with councils, to talk about this work of inclusion, what it means to do this work, or to do a presentation similar to this, to explain some definitions or why community of faith may choose to move forward. I know my colleague in ministry, Pastor Trish Schmermond, is also willing and able to engage in that work as well. And so if that's something your community of faith is interested in engaging with, we would certainly be happy to talk with you further about what that might look like.
Sorry, I had to just attend to a contract that is replacing a floor in our house. If I could just say and continue to finish what I was saying earlier, I was struck by the tone of the discussion among the students and how positive it was. And two things that came out that struck me, well, perhaps the strongest thing was that that everyone was in agreement that it's not enough just to know that your pastor is affirming, accepting. It's important that to know that the church is also accepting, and for that to happen, there needs to be some kind of declaration, some kind of tangible symbol. And so one individual who's lesbian, admitted, I don't know if I am welcome in the church I grew up in. It's ambiguous. It's not clear to me. So I guess all I'm trying to say by that is these kind of statements, they can seem kind of, I don't know, tokenism, but they're really not. And for our ministry, what I've realized is that we need to do a more robust job of, you know what I mean, making our position, our welcoming position clear. So that's all I was going to add. Yeah.
Thanks, Richard. I think that's a really important point, that becoming a welcoming congregation is more than simply just saying, I'm a welcoming pastor. That's definitely step one. But it's also important to do the actual work. So not just putting up a pride flag, but having discussions, having people come in to do education, to actually make it a safe place. Just because that you're a safe person doesn't mean the congregation's safe. Just because you put a rainbow flag up doesn't mean the people in the pews won't treat someone in a way that makes them feel like an outsider or like they're not welcome. So it's important to do the work, to be an ally, but to know there's never an ending point to that. There's always more learning and more that we can do together as communities of faith to recognize this. And so bless you as you do that. And I know there's one opportunity. I'll invite Keiko. You're actually doing a class on queer theologies. If you want to just talk about that as a way to learn more deeply on a seminary course level.
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. I feel like your talk should have been like a prerequisite for anybody who's taking the class. In April, there will be a 1-week intensive on queer theologies, plural. As Lindsay pointed out, there's like all these varieties, and it's really looking at what queer theologies are and how to integrate them into our theology, so that we're not like just adding on, where this is sort of the really deep allyship, I think, that Lindsay is calling us to. And that's available to pastors to audit. So check with LTS, but some of those books, lots of books, I'll add to the list of what Lindsay's doing, to just, continue the work that Lindsay started for us.
Thanks, Keiko, for that. And Dave, yeah.
Hi. Let me add our thanks for your presentation too. We were eager to hear this and needed to hear it, and you have been enormously helpful. Very gracious too. I'm wondering where we are at with our congregations, and since we're to be sensitive to our language, are we still using reconciling in Christ terms, or is it welcoming church?
So reconciling in Christ, in short, Dave, talks about going through a certain program and getting a certificate to say we've done the work. It is the official Lutheran way to say we have done the work. We're an RIC congregation. This really only means something to Lutherans who know. If it's someone coming from the outside, they're like, I don't know what RIC means. So it's important to say both, to say we are working to be a welcoming and affirming congregation of the ELCIC, or to say, we welcome specifically LGBTQ2SIA+ people. This is important to say. It's welcoming and affirming. Every congregation says all are welcome, but what do you mean by that welcome? Similar to the summer, many of us in the midst of worship probably said, we need to say Black Lives Matter, or we need to say Indigenous Lives Matter, Queer Lives Matter. These are things that are easy to say in the midst of a welcome, that can especially note that we're a welcoming congregation. We're on a journey of welcome. And once we have an RIC status, we can say that too. So in the United Church, their branch is called Affirm. So you'll hear them say we're an affirming congregation, which also for them means they've gone through a process.
Thank you for the clarification. And I can verify that once the congregation has made the decision, you still have to keep that in the forefront, as Richard is saying, because I was part of a congregation in Winnipeg. We went through the RIC and we got the certificate. And I went back and visited and I asked, how is this going? And the remark was, it's the best kept secret we have, which was awful.
So I know at Holy Spirit, where I serve, about 5 years ago, we have taken, there's a celebration of RIC at the end of January, and we've actually taken the whole month as a month of inclusion. So every year we do some kind of piece of information, some kind of piece of learning, some kind of piece of sharing, and then culminating that month of learning with an RIC affirmation service, similar to what we might do for Black History Month in February, some time of learning, commemorating, and uplifting stories from the margins.
Mm.
Thanks, Dave. I know we're getting down to the end of our time, but any other questions, comments, things that haven't been raised yet, you can certainly email me directly, pastorlindsay.js@gmail.com. I can put that in the chat. I have sun in my face, sorry about that. But I can put that in the chat. You're welcome to engage with me further there if you have a specific question.
Richard here again. Sorry, I'm
Hi, Richard.
blabbing away here, but that's the curse of an extroverted personality. Anyway, yeah, a colleague said one time that Richard is an extrovert. That means he has to open his mouth to know what he's thinking. Anyway, so long story short, in the discussion with students, another thing came out. We were talking about how we should frame our new statement. Should it say that, you know, we welcome people of all sexual orientations, gender identities and expressions, or should we say we welcome LGBTQ 2SIA+? And actually, what they ended up, the consensus was we should do both. We should have both in there. And the reason was because those letters, as you were saying earlier, they're kind of an undeniable kind of marker, I guess. At least that, yeah. And so they wanted, in the end, for not the more generic statement, but, well, or if the generic, but then this other included as well. So, and I'm just passing that on. That was, I think it affirms what you've been saying.
For sure, Richard. I think that's the most inclusive thing to do is kind of naming it both ways, uplifting. You know, we do welcome all, and this is what all means. And it's like you said, you did a statement many years ago, and now you're having to update it. So again, affirming that is good and holy work that you're doing. And I think even within our own liturgies, we're coming to figure out how we can best address everyone present, how we can best be inclusive of everyone present. And so that's just part of the work we do every week as we gather as church, whether it's virtual or in person. Keiko.
I'm wondering if you have any recommendations for any kind of confirmation age material, because I find one of the things that happens is when we have these conversations is we think the conversation is only for adults and not for confirmation students, and yet those are the kids that in school are already learning about all these different things. And so I'm wondering if you have any recommendations or thoughts or how to navigate that when some parents get a little antsy.
What I would say is the kids are all right. The kids are light years ahead of us, and many of them are already in GSAs, many gay straight alliances, many of them are already allies. They say, why are we talking about this? That was my large experience with any young group of people. I've gone to GSAs. I think it's more, like you said, Keiko, managing parents, managing people who haven't had it. So maybe what I would suggest is a class for students and a class for parents. Do the parent class before, saying this is the stuff I'm going to talk about. Here's the definitions. Your kids may have some questions, some things that they want to talk about. We're going to talk about those too, and I'm going to affirm that God loves them no matter who they are, no matter how they identify. And that's really the important part of why we're talking about this today. I think a lot of people here, we're going to talk about sexuality and immediately start tail spinning into this fear mode. We don't need to fear talking about these things. So I would say largely conversations with kids, super easy. They're going to be like, oh, I already know this. Pastor, can't we do something more fun? But there's lots of good YouTube content of young people talking about for themselves how they feel as young as kind of drag queens who are 5 saying, I like to play with gender, this is who I am. Maybe engaging some of those peer videos that feel good and right for you and your context to say, you know, here's someone who's your age who identifies in this way. How would we welcome them? or if there's someone in your own group that wants to speak about their own experience. Many kids are used to that in GSAs, in schools nowadays. Maybe they want to take a risk and share. So that would be one possibility. Phil. Oh, you're just muted, Phil.
One confession and 2 questions. So I confess that I come to conversations like this with a certain amount of generalized anxiety. I think it's important to come anyway, but that's just where I am. And so the 2 questions are, one, we mentioned that we're wanting to celebrate 10 years of the decision. I think I'm not the only one with generalized anxiety. I think we have a history in our church. I call it the Voldemort history, the decision that shall not be named, or the conflict that shall not be named. What is your suggestion for how we can talk about that history in an honest and hopeful and life-giving way? And my second question is there such a thing as heterofragility?
Thanks, Phil. 5 minutes left. The hardest hitting questions, but I'm here for you. So yes and yes. So I think what you're naming is there's largely been a systemic way our church has been privileged towards people who are heterosexual, people who are straight, people who fit within a certain mold of what for a long time we have termed to be Christian or Lutheran. I think we see this reflected in the Black Lives Matter movement of people finally calling out the systemic oppressions that they see and naming them. And so I think our anxiety around that is that we've gone on a journey these last 10 years, but many of us haven't named what that journey is. Maybe 10 years ago, we were in a different place than we are now. Maybe we've come to a place of affirming or allyship. Maybe we haven't. Maybe there's some guilt around that, some anxiety around that, that someone's going to say you're homophobic, that someone's going to say you're not doing enough, that someone might say you're not allowed here. Because the honest part of this, Phil, is that in 10 years, we haven't done a lot. The number of churches that have become RIC or become safe hasn't really risen. We haven't had these conversations. And so even to be able to name or commemorate, we made a decision 10 years ago, and we need to maybe start doing some work now. The world has changed. We need to love each other better, understand each other better. But within that, there's privilege to say as leaders, you know, this is a safe place. This is a place where we're going to have these conversations because we need to start talking about this. But there's certain ways that we care and love each other through that. And one thing that we need to start doing is saying no to homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia within those conversations. As a leader, we need to be able to step up and say, if someone starts saying something that's homophobic, like, oh, marriage really is only for, no, sorry, actually, our official statement of the church is this now. We've learned that God loves and accepts all peoples, all families. So it is a hard kind of line to figure out and walk, but we can do it graciously, just like we've been doing today. I'd say by and large, many of our rostered leaders within the church have been on a journey. So even to acknowledge that personal journey for yourself, I think starts with a place of vulnerability, that people can change, that people do change, and that it's a holy thing to change. God often renames us once we have gone through a change. And I think that's a biblical narrative we can use to say, you know, maybe we are being called to be renamed as an RIC community. Not to change the name of the church, but to take on that new label as ally, or take on that new label of affirming congregation. And there's certainly some fragility there in losing places of privilege or seeming to lose places of privilege. Just because you're welcoming more people doesn't mean your place becomes any less important. It just means that God's love and light gets to shine further. So why wouldn't we want to be a community of faith that does that, where people can feel like they can truly become a part of that community? With our own structure, we know that part of that revolves around a vote. So even to acknowledge that there are systems at play that keep us from making these decisions on the fly that can be good and can be bad, but it may at some point take a vote to say, yes, we're headed in this direction, or not at this time. So I hope that's helpful, Phil, in the midst of some of what you were asking. Appreciate that.
In light of our time and hearing a little bit of a silence here, although there are many, many questions that that would percolate and come up or rise up. And I do hope that many questions do rise, that we can engage in a conversation and a dialogue as we move to be better allies, to be better friends and better sisters and brothers in Christ. So thank you so much, Pastor Lindsay, for coming out again, for making yourself vulnerable again. And thank you for trusting us enough that you are able to educate us and that we may partner with you. Hopefully, by God's grace, we will, going forward, have many more dialogues of such and many more discussions. May God grant us the grace, the strength, and the courage to do so. And knowing that we have a partner in you to answer those questions or to help us in this journey and walk with us. So thank you so much for being there. And
thanks for holding some space.
Absolutely. Again, coming to a close, a reminder that the session is being recorded and will be posted on our Synod website later on. So if you'd like to refer, if you'd like to have someone else watch it as well from your congregations, feel free to do so. Upcoming Synod Connect events, we will have Bishop Ada with us next month on December the 10th as we talk about Columbia Connections. And in January, we'll have Pastor Marcus Wilhelm talking to us about Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Letters from Prison. That session does require a pre-reading, so please do register to get more information on that. With no further announcements or messages to pass on, may we go with God's blessing, God's peace, in knowing that God surrounds us with God's love and help, that we may go forth to talk, to be educated, and be God's ministers. God be with you, and thank you for joining.